Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Your daughter, I was looking at her.
Just funny how I just have to like you and
Well, good morning, and sorry we were getting started just a couple of minutes late. And good to see you all. Hopefully, safe drives in. Snow wasn't too bad. The snow was part of my problem today. My car blacked out on Monday, where I'm driving down the road and I'm on the bypass, and I'm headed to Pasco to pick up dewormer medicine for my animal, and I missed the light, so I'm at the light on the freeway, headed from Richland towards Pasco Kennewick. If you take a left, you are on Wellesian Way and Aaron Drive. Take a right, you'd go up towards Dupertel.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle lane. I'm sitting at the light. It's not just that my motor quits, the entire car blacks out and there is no power whatsoever.
Electrical.
Yeah, electrical. And so my one daughter dropped me off yesterday, and today I'm driving my other daughter's car, and it's not parked in the garage, and it was covered with snow, and it kind of. So I apologize that we're getting started a couple minutes late. If you're joining us live online, we don't have a host today. I won't be able to answer questions. So puts added opportunity on you all. If as we work through this, you have any questions, just ask them, because dialogue is much better than just monologue. And let me pray for us. And we are in 1 Corinthians, I believe, chapter 7, verse 1 today. Loving Father, thank you for this day, and we lift up everybody out traveling in our area. Just may you give them safety, and Lord, we just pray no accidents. We lift up our opportunity that we have to be in your word today, and you give us your scriptures because you love us. You also give us your scriptures so that we might become wise, and you give us your word that we might not make mistakes. And as we have been in a prolonged discussion in Corinthians about how to conduct ourselves as sexual beings, and the focus has been on what not to do, Lord, as we kind of turn to the topic of, and here is what you intended, but now let's get into some specifics. Lift up these passages and these words that we might consider just how they apply to each of us. So bless us today in Jesus' name. Amen.
So how did you get your car home? How did you get out of the middle lane?
I got made fun of yesterday because I ended up I told the story to staff, and then I had a meeting where we at the beginning of our committee meeting we do a one-word check-in, and mine was thankful. So I'm very thankful for what happened. And then I went into another meeting, and Jan Jacobson was going to be there, and she lives in my neck of the woods. So I asked her at the beginning of the meeting if she could give me a ride home, because I've given her rides in a couple of times when she had her surgery, and she was like, "Sure, but what happened to your car?" And so like I'm telling the story for the third time, and there's people, "Oh man, Ralph can't not tell this story," but. So the light turns green, and just before it turns, just before it turns green, it just blacks out, and so I'm sitting there, and I push the brake and I push the button, and nothing comes on, and there's no power whatsoever, and cars are starting to go by on my right side, and there's really no cars looking to turn left. It's almost 4. It's like about 3:50, and it's getting dark, and it was dark on Monday, and I realize I have no lights whatsoever, and there's the car that's just right behind me because they were expecting me to move, and then there's a couple cars behind them, and then there's cars that are beginning to honk at me as they go by, you know, and
Thank you.
thank you. But I sit there and I go, okay, so first thing is, it's safe. I get out of the car, I go to the person behind me and I say, do you have a few minutes? I said, all the electrical has gone out and so I don't have any lights. And one of my concerns is that I need hazards because if I think I could get rear-ended in a situation like this. And it was a mom and a child and she said, yeah, I could do that. And so she turns on her hazards. I say, I'm going to call a tow truck company. Call the tow truck company. There's one on Wellesian. They were there within 3-4 minutes. And so within 10 minutes, my car was at the BMW dealer, which was right there, you know. So I mean, but I couldn't even move my car because it was stuck in gear. So anyways, very thankful. And the dealership even had a courtesy shuttle. And so our well-laid plans, which could have been blown up based upon, but we were gonna, the whole family was gonna watch the national championship game that started at 4:30, and I was picking up the cat medicine, and then picking up the pizzas, and Hannah went and picked up the cat medicine and the pizza. And I got home at 4:27, so I didn't miss 1 minute of an opening quarter that I could have missed the entire opening quarter. And then I was driven home by Jan Jacobson, who's a huge Michigan fan. And she wore her jacket and her sweatshirt, and she probably had a T-shirt on underneath it. But we resolved that we would not talk about the game on the car trip. So as we move into this section in chapter 7, it begins with these words. Now, for the matters that you wrote about. So there's a shift. We have been talking about reports that Paul has been dealing with. And one of there were two big things. Factions in the church. I've been baptized by Peter, I've been baptized by Paul, I've been baptized by Apollos. It looks like some of those factions may have an ethnic origin. Apollos being Greek, Peter being Jewish, Paul being a Roman citizen. And so there are certain factions that are kind of lining up about that. There's this wisdom issue, there's this spiritual kind of elitism issue going on. And then we move into a concrete example of an issue of sexual immorality. A son is sleeping with his father's wife. And most likely the father has died and he's now married his father's wife. And they're celebrating this, but not everybody's celebrating this. And the guy is unrepentant, so Paul gives him all this instructions. But there's probably still factions in the church, and this is a little bit why Paul is hearing about this, because what he tells them is that I'm hearing this from everyone. In chapter 7, verse 1, they wrote him a letter, and they have some questions. You're our apostle. We're not sure really what to do, and so could you answer these things? And there's a little bit here, just stepping back and going. So there was the stuff that they wrote about, and then there's the stuff that they didn't write about. And Paul dealt first with the stuff that they didn't write about, because this was really important stuff. Now, these things are important, and Paul deals with them and gives them time, but There is this contention, and there's probably a little bit of this sense of, the question for us is, why did they only write about this, and why didn't they write about the other stuff? Why did Paul only hear about the other stuff, and why didn't they? And could be that they wanted to deal with nice things. We didn't want to get a big reprimand. We wanted to get a pat on the back. And in fact, there's an interesting thing that goes on here. And let me just read the rest of verse 1. Now, for the matters that you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. Now, here's this question. Who's saying that? Now, they did not have quotation marks in Greek back then. So it's not immediately clear, is this their statement and Paul's responding to it? And we've seen in our translation just last week where the translators, because they had a sense of confidence, Paul was picking up the language of his interlocutors, the people he was dialed in, where they're headed in one direction, and Paul's saying, no, that's not the direction that you want to go. I don't want to call them opponents, because Paul's wanting to win them all back. But here's this position that's being put forward in the church. They're writing, Paul's responding. We don't know what they wrote. Most likely, this first sentence is their words.
Mine doesn't say Mary.
What does yours say?
Mine says not to have sexual relations with a woman.
Yeah, my thing.
I've got the footnote for that. Or the
It's in quotes, though.
Let me think back to the. Let me think back to, because I'm reading the NIV 1984, and let me just think back to. I really want to go grab my. This is what you would call as a textual issue, and it's going to take me 1 minute, and I apologize to people online, but I'm going to grab my Greek New Testament, and I'll even do a little bit of teaching about this, because I think this will be worthwhile. Just a second.
Sorry.
No, it's good. She's back 1 week.
because mine has the P by the Mary. And then it says here, or it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So that's not whatever that otherwise.
Yeah.
Pastor Ralph taught us something today.
This is 85.
You raised a good question. We need to get this straightened out.
We should. I've probably been sinning for a very, very long time. Down the rabbit hole we go. Here's our dialogue.
Yeah.
Greek says, which is closer to the original.
So this is a nice thing. So it is not it is not a textual issue, which I thought it might be. It's actually a decision about the translators to try to make clear the intention of what's being said. Literally, it's saying it's good not to get married, but the context is about sexual relations within the context of marriage.
Doesn't that create tension with getting married and procreating and?
Right. Well, so this is what we're going to find in this passage is that, and this was one of the things to lead with. Okay, so before we had the reports of what Paul was hearing. Now we have a letter that was written. It may assume that this makes things clearer for us in interpretation, but it actually causes us to have more caution because they have a whole bunch of stuff that they've written that they know that they wrote, and Paul has read it and he's responding to it. He may not give us as much information about the background. So what we're reading is that, and this is a great analogy. Always remember that when we're dealing with a letter, what we're dealing with is we're listening to one side of a conversation. And it's a little bit like listening to one side of a phone conversation where you hear what this person's saying, but you don't hear what the other people are saying. And so this becomes something where it's like, in this section, we need to be a little bit more cautious. Paul's going to deal with a number of issues. The context here is, okay, we've been talking about improper sexual relations. Now we're going to talk about proper sexual relations, which is within the context of marriage. Most likely, this statement, it is good, and we're gonna. I'm going to use the more literal. It is, and there's. I have a guess as well why your translations have switched to sexual relations. This passage has had a major influence in the church towards saying, and in fact, there's an irony to this, is this is one of the places where people have ended up interpreting this stuff as if it's to say the more spiritual route is not to get married. And Roman Catholic priests can't get married. And, and it really calls into question a church can go ahead and structure themselves that way and say the only people who can be pastors or priests are people who are single. But it's pretty weak foundation to say because that's the way that God wants it. Yeah. And it's the most spiritual way to approach it. So I think what probably the NIV did after 1984 is that they gave you more of an interpretation so that you wouldn't get confused, because the context here is about the proper way. And it's going to be dealing with in the context of marriage, and should we get married? Should we remain married? And that seems to be what's going on in this passage. It is behind this. If this is in quotations, and if this is what they're saying, it's better not to be married. Because underlying this, it would look like there's this sense that to engage in sexual relations is immoral. And so let's avoid having any sex as husbands and wives so that we can be spiritually pure. And Paul is going to address that and say, no. Yeah, that was fun though. Thank you. It was good. I couldn't picture what the Greek text was saying there, and so then that was a part. The other option is that we had alternative readings. And I'll save it for another day. So, well, how many people here understand the practice of textual criticism and what textual critics do to put together our New Testament? I've got one, kind of, two. Are you interested?
Always.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so this is important stuff. So this is the USB 4th edition, and it is the very same as the Nestle Allen 27. And I'm at the place where I'm probably going to buy another one because they're now, I think it's Nestle Allen 29, and they've updated it a little bit. When this was made, we had about 4,500 witnesses to the Greek New Testament as far as different specific manuscripts. Today, that number is almost up to, I think, about 6,000, because what continues to happen is that we discover more manuscript witnesses. Now, when the original author, Paul, wrote 1 Corinthians, that original copy would have been called an autograph. That's just the way that we make reference to ancient documents. Everything in the ancient world, obviously, they had no computers or typewriters, so it was handwritten. So we call it an autograph. There is not one document that we have from the ancient world where we have an autograph. The nature of things is that time weakens us, dissolves us, makes us less pliable. I'm speaking across the board. We human beings, we experience this. I am not nearly as limber as I used to be, so the earliest things that we had were tablets, clay, and then we moved forward and we had papyrus and we had animal skin. And you got to get the conditions right for those things to be preserved. And so this is the challenge. And in some instances, these things would mold, would decay, especially in bad conditions. And so they had to make a copy of the autograph. And then what we see in the churches is that very early on there was an understanding that what was being given by the apostles, including the apostle Paul, was scripture. And so they were making copies of this and sending it out to other churches so that they could have the words of the apostles. But in all documents, if you want to preserve it, you're going to have to make copies of it. And so, with all of the great works, there were different copies. And so then what happens is that, and this takes place over centuries, you make a copy, it's expensive, it's laborious. And so what happens is that our window into the ancient world and our window before there was a printing press is through a witness. And it was going to be a copy, but it was going to be a copy that was maybe copied centuries, sometimes a millennia after it had been written. But there had been a copy and a copy and a copy. Now, this is the way all ancient manuscripts come to us. If you have one witness, you have some idea of what the person said, but you don't have any real way to test how much change has crept in over time to this document. So the more witnesses you have, the more evidence that you have to move towards the original. Textual criticism is a branch of history where there are these blessed scholars who commit their entire life to study ancient documents, and they'll become specialists in areas. Now, This is what we have to do for all documents of history. Plato's Republic, Homer's Iliad, the lives of Plutarch, I think, or Plutarch the Lives. Anything that we have from the ancient world before the printing press, this is the story. In most instances where we feel pretty good that we have the basic idea of what this author said, especially if we can have a number of witnesses. Outside of the New Testament, Homer's Iliad, I believe, maybe it's his Odyssey, but is the best contested document that we have from the ancient world. We have about 500 witnesses to Homer's Odyssey, or I think it's Iliad. And so you've got 500 different copies that are in the original language of Greek that are in some way its own specific witness. The earliest copy, because a copy is not the original autograph, but it is somebody who has written it all down to make a book based upon a prior book that was based upon a prior book that was based upon the autograph. The earliest witness that we have of a specific copy dates something like 800 to 1,000 years after Homer wrote the Iliad, and which is about 800 BC. But we've got that one, it's the earliest, and then we have a bunch of other copies that continue, 1,000, 1,400 years, but we have 500 of them. And you can go through and this is what the scholar does, they compare all of the witnesses. And then they circle where there is divergence. And it's a pretty simple process overall, which is if all of the witnesses read this sentence the complete same way, then you have no doubt this is the original. If you have 499 that read it this way and one that reads it another way, it's pretty straightforward. And if you're going to do this, with exactitude, people will write their dissertations on this. They'll break all of these things down and they'll make their arguments and stuff like that. Oftentimes, it's an issue of spelling or of a word that looks close. Sometimes there's added words. And the thing is you don't know if it's an addition or omission. And that becomes one sort of textual issue. And it's either addition or omission, and because they diverge, we don't know. Did these witnesses omit it, or did these ones add it? But as you read the text, it might make some sense to you.
But language to language, the syntax would be differently too, right?
Well, not necessarily. Greek is an inflected language, and so it does not matter where the word is in a sentence.
Okay.
And so Greek, in fact, is more challenging this way, because you could put in an entire clause or take out an entire clause and it wouldn't change anything else, because you would know that it's a clause based upon the formation of the word. So no, it's not quite like English where you go subject,
Right.
verb,
Predicate.
object.
Yeah.
And so in that Greek is, and then the other part though is that because Greek is an inflected language, sometimes word order matters, or there'll be a different word order.
Right.
It'll say the very same thing, but the words won't be in the same order. So it's omission or addition, or it's transposition.
Okay.
And then that's basically it. And this becomes the part where you can have two witnesses and they have a different word and there's a different word spelling. And in some way you would identify that as an omission or addition, where we know that it's one of these two words, but we don't know which one is, so we don't know which one added this word and which one omitted this word. And sometimes it's pretty obvious because it's just a matter of changing a couple of letters. And then you can read it, and then the textual critic can say, in Homer's Odyssey, we have 350 witnesses that this is the word that they use. And while we have some 20 witnesses that it's this other word in this context, and then when they reconstruct the Greek text based upon all the witnesses and say, here's the authoritative text by which we're going to translate Homer's Iliad into English. This is the text we're recommending, and here's why. Now, most things from the ancient world, it's pretty typical that the time span between the original autograph and the first witness is a pretty long time, like 500 years, 700 years, 1,000 years. Because ancient documents, the older they are, the more fragile they become, and so we just don't have as much from way back when we're talking about something that was written in 800 BC. I give you all of that as a background because when we come to the New Testament, this is the part where if you're going to and I'll just give you the summary statement. If you're going to trust any document from the ancient world, that what we have through the work of textual critics of paying attention to our witnesses and then constructing and offering what we believe to be the original reading, if you're going to trust anything from the ancient world, not because of faith, but just because of the science of textual criticism, the document that you're going to trust is the New Testament. Because most ancient documents have 5 to 15 witnesses. Homer is the exception when it has 500. But when it comes to the Greek New Testament, we have now almost 6,000 witnesses. But it's not just that we have 6,000 witnesses, it's also the time span. The entire New Testament was done sometime by the end of the first century. We conclude that probably Revelation is the latest book. It's probably written in 92 to 95 AD. If you go to London, you can go to the Library of London, and they have their ancient documents room. And if you go in there, you will find Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandria. And these are 2 complete copies of the New Testament that date from the early 4th century. And we have 4 of these major textual families. The other really big one is Codex Vaticanus, which is in the Vatican. But this is the part where in a 300-year time span, we have a complete copy of the New Testament. Now, that's just kind of scratching the surface. Remember in the beginning that these were written individually, and only at the end of the first century did we do the work, did the science of, or the technology of creating a book come forward. And in the ancient world, we call books a codex. And right around the time of the writing of the New Testament, you began to see the emergence of these codexes, these books. Because prior to that, you would have just scrolls. And I've told this story before, but the limitation of a scroll is 33 feet. A scroll can only be 33 feet long, and if it gets longer than that, it breaks in half, and that doesn't do you any good. So in the ancient world, before there were books, if you were going to write something, you either had to make the decision that what I was going to write was going to be contained in up to 33 feet of material, or I was going to have multiple volumes. And just so you know, Luke's gospel would fill about a 33-foot scroll, and Acts would fill about a 33-foot scroll, and it really is written to be a volume 1 and a volume 2. But with the codex, you've got a binding, and you're bound together, and you can make that puppy really thick. It's fine. So in that, then, we started to have, and very early on, in the early part of the first century, or the second century, between 100 and 180, they started collecting and putting together the 4 Gospels. and those were put into a collection of books. And the one of the witnesses that we have to this is the Diatessaron, which is through the four, and it was the first attempt to try to harmonize the witness of the four Gospels into one story, and that takes place in 185. The reason that is that there was this sense of authority all through the Orthodox Church, that just as there's four corners to the earth, God has provided four Gospels so that we can have the story of Jesus. And those went together. Similarly, they put the letters of Paul together, and they circulated the letters of Paul in a book. Now, there's some codexes, but there's still a lot of scrolls. Our earliest basic witness to the New Testament, where we have like complete books of the New Testament, are papyrus, and we have about 99 of them. And some of them are really significant. We have these papyrus that date somewhere within 100 to 150 years after the autographs were written, up to the time of Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. So 6,000 copies, complete copies within 300 years. Earlier witnesses of complete books within a couple hundred years. And then there's this. Out of those 6,000 witnesses, most of them are not complete copies. They might be a witness to a book. They might be a witness to the four Gospels. They might be a witness to a section of the New Testament that has survived. They might be one page from one Gospel. At this point, the earliest witness that we have to the New Testament is called the John Rylands fragment. And it is a little slip of papyrus, and it has writing on the front and the back, and it comes from the Gospel of John. And it's just a few verses, and it's not complete verses, but but that fragment dates from about 125 AD, which is, if the Gospel of John was probably written like what we think is between 80 and 85, you're talking about a time span of 50 years. There's nothing like this in any other ancient documents, and no other ancient documents have the consistency of a short time span between the autograph and the witnesses that we have. So what happens is the textual critics with the New Testament, their job is to take all of the information, work through this process of, which is really a science of textual criticism about analyzing the text. Because we have so many witnesses of the New Testament, and because the Bible are the Christian sacred scriptures, and we treat these with more respect, significance, and committed Christians a desire to know God's Word, there are textual critics who do their doctoral dissertation, and they've identified textual families when it comes to the New Testament. They have Codex Sinaiticus, and they have this complete copy, and then they've identified that here's another witness that's 100 years removed that follows exactly Codex Sinaiticus. And they lump these things together in families. And in fact, in some of these things, they have the people who are transcribing, and they make little notes. And there'll be doctoral dissertations on the scribes of and what they did. And so there's a lot of information that they're sifting through. But in the end, all of that information gives you more confidence because you have more witness, because you have more opportunities. And what it means is, and this is what, And we Christians hide none of it. And so this is not the most complete apparatus. This is the one that's used, that's the most, it tells you what's most important. There are approximately 10,000 lines of text in our New Testament. Out of those 10,000 lines, there are approximately 100 lines where textual critics are not sure what the original reading is. We know what the alternatives are. We're just not sure which of these alternatives is the actual one. And in this apparatus, there's a more extensive one that I don't have, and translators use it, but this is the one for me where it was like, okay, is this a textual issue? When there's significant divergence between the witnesses, in the footnotes, they will tell you, and they will put a letter by it, A, B, C, or D. And A and B says, we're really confident that what we put as the text is the original. But here are the other alternative readings, and here are the significant witnesses so that you can analyze them. And there's issues about what's the theology, what branch of the churches it's coming from. There are some witnesses that we feel, we know are very early, and so those have prominence. Because if I have a witness that's dating from 200 AD and I have a witness that diverges and it's from 1400 AD, I'm probably going to go with the earlier one, especially if I have some other witnesses that go along with that. That's the science of textual criticism. They're trying to give us the best reading. In C and D, and that's where there's about 100 of these, they really don't know, they don't have great confidence that we know which is the original. And so, and this is, you'll see this at times in your translation. Some texts say, and they will give you an alternative reading. There's basically 100 of those. It may be that in the next 50 years, that number will go down because we're getting more witnesses. They continue to do this work. The big thing to know about this is that out of the 10,000 lines of the New Testament and the 100 lines where we're not sure what the original reading is, doesn't mean that we don't know what they said. We're just not sure which of these is the right witness to what they said. Does that make sense? None of those 100 have any impact on any significant theological issue, question, or idea. And so, that this is the part where, you'll hear things like this. 99.5% of the New Testament that we have, we have great confidence that what you're reading is exactly what the original authors intended for you to read. And then there's these other places where we're not quite sure, and we share it, and we're aware of it, and we look at it, and then it becomes, and so that's what textual criticism does. The big critique against the New Testament, you'll sometimes hear this both by atheists and by Mormons who want us to undermine and stuff, is well, you've heard of the phone game, right? And, so somebody tells you one thing, and then you tell somebody, and you tell somebody else. And, it's true that a message can change if we pass it along and we're not careful. But if we human beings want to be careful, then we can do a really good job of making sure that the message gets delivered. And the people who are making the copies of the New Testament were really careful. Some of the things that you'll see in the New Testament as far as the changes that kind of crept in, where the textual critics, was often scribes correcting the grammar of the apostles because they didn't always use the best Greek. And then the scholars could actually recognize and say, this scribe had this tendency to correct these things. And then sometimes what happened is that there would be a scribal note and then the copyists didn't recognize that they were doing a note, and then they would add it. But there's stories about how this emerges. But I think it's good for us to understand generally how this process works, what it's produced, and then the confidence. You could if you want to say that we can trust in nothing from the ancient world, well, you're making a highly skeptical decision that says now you are purposely putting your head in the sand that I will not be a student of history. If you want to be open to the fact that we can know something of the ancient world and that we can actually have some idea of what ancients who wrote thought, then and that we can and because we have multiple witnesses, we can do hard work and we can try to give ourselves the best understanding of what Julius Caesar said when he did his history of the Gallic War. Which that one I think is, we've got about 5 copies of that, and I think that the earliest one is something like 800 years after. But anybody who reads Julius Caesar's record of the Gallic War, that's basically what Julius Caesar said. There might be some textual question, but the gist of it, the majority of it. But with the New Testament, it's just so much better. Carrie, and then I'll answer.
Stop me if I'm derailing the discussion. Just to make sure I'm clear on the point, if I take something from around the time of the Gospels that's important from that period, like the complete works of Philo, and I look at those, are those not as close to the original autograph as the New Testament would be?
Yeah. So for people online, if we go back to say something contemporaneous like the works of Philo, Josephus, we don't have an autograph. We have a witness, and it's a copy, and there's going to be a time span. There is nothing that compares to the New Testament. The average time span on any ancient document that we have is 500 to 800 years. I don't know of anything. I like off the top of my head, and I'm not an expert in this, but I've done this enough as far as being able to both try to give context to saying what we have in the New Testament versus other ancient documents. Is that we have more witnesses that are closer in time span through the New Testament, and there is nothing that compares to the New Testament, not even close, when it comes to either a fragment or a complete book. Hundreds of year difference between the earliest witness that we have.
And they don't, in books like the complete works of Philo, they don't even mention the textual criticism or give you notes.
No, I mean sometimes in some apparatuses you will, like, and it depends on your specialty. Basically Homer was for Greeks. It was the world-defining story of Greek society, and then it continued to play an influence. And so Homer was the most important voice for Greeks because he shaped their stories of just expectation. And so some scholars like N.T. Wright would say, as an analogy, Homer was their Bible. And that's why we have so many witnesses. That's why there's 500. It was the most important book. There are significant writers and philosophers where we don't have anything of what they wrote. We just know that others, and sometimes we might have some things that were quoted. I think Livy has a history of Rome, and we don't have the entire history because it's just been lost. And
Good.
It was.
Yeah, do these scholars know what the original language used by the authors was? Because I can't believe Peter knew how to speak Greek.
Yeah. let me repeat the question. Do we know what the original language was, and could somebody like Peter have spoken Greek? Many people were multilingual in the ancient world, and so the idea that they and Greek, and this is one of the interesting things as far as looking both at the issue of plausibility. Could a Galilean fisherman have spoken Greek? That one is definitely a yes. Fishermen were tradesmen, they were commerce. The common language of trade was Greek. Now, what's interesting of this is even more fun, is that the language of the New Testament, the Greek of the New Testament, is not scholarly Greek. The typical language of philosophers in writing in Greek is what's called Attic Greek. That for a long time, the interpreters of the Greek New Testament assume that maybe this is like a spiritual Greek, because it doesn't read the way that you would read Homer or Plato or Aristotle. It's different, a little bit different endings, a little bit different way of pronunciation. And then what ended up happening is that we found, as we did archaeology, we started to unearth lists, writings, and it looked exactly like the New Testament. And now this koine means common. The language of the New Testament is the language of the streets. It's not the language that you speak at the Ivy League. It was the common language. And so pretty much all the New Testament really is reflective of Koine Greek. Could Peter have spoken Greek? Absolutely. Being multilingual throughout the world today is a common thing. Greek was the homogeneous language that brought together Greco-Roman society. Did Peter have the ability to write his Gospels? Well, one of the things that we recognize is, and we see this in Paul, is that Paul at times uses a secretary. He speaks it, somebody else writes it. Tradition holds that the Gospel of Mark is actually John Mark, who was a companion of Paul and Barnabas. He ends up being associated with Peter in Rome, and John Mark is basically recording Peter's gospel, the life of Jesus that he spoke. We have two other witnesses to Peter, which is 1 Peter and 2 Peter, and those claim to be by Peter, but they were probably almost invariably written by a secretary. So he told the person what to write, and then they wrote it. And one of the reasons that we think this is that the Greek of 1st and 2nd Peter is some of the best Greek in the New Testament. It's some of the hardest to interpret. The Gospel of John, which would be one of the ones where we have a Galilean fisherman who, didn't receive the highest education, it's actually the simplest Greek in the New Testament. And so that becomes something where you say, is it plausible that Peter and John and many of the apostles spoke Greek as well as Aramaic? Absolutely. And some of them probably had some understanding of Hebrew. And Hebrew would be the language of the Old Testament. With the Apostle Paul, Paul was a Pharisaic Jew who was a Roman citizen who was raised in Tarsus, and so he probably knew Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, and he was proficient in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. I don't know if I completely answered your question. We can dialogue. Trying to.
Was the language of the Palestinian era in the beginning, or 00 AD?
Yeah.
Was it Greek?
Okay, great question. So, giving ourselves a historical picture of in 4 BC, approximately, when Jesus was born. And in that time period, what's going on in Palestine? In some senses, to answer this question, we have to understand what happened when Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world. Alexander the Great, starting in Macedon, went down and he took over North Africa, Egypt, all of Asia Minor, and then was making his way into the depths of India. When he did this, he had this, part of his method was bringing Greek culture with him and setting up Greek cities and establishing Greek as the common language for the empire. And even though he lived a short life, and we call this historically Hellenism, and he basically Greekanized the ancient world. And what he did was that the Greek language became the common language. And then, as you go through, there's different areas where they would have their local customs, but the world became a little smaller. The Romans continued this process when there's that shift of power from what Alexander the Great did. Immediately upon his death, his 4 generals divided his empire up into 4 parts. And so you have the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are the main players in the area of Palestine. They both follow the Hellenization process of continuing with Greek. But you would have the local custom and the local language, but if you wanted to do commerce, if you wanted to work in the courts, you had to learn Greek. And you kind of learned language and culture philosophy. So, by the time we get to 4 BC, the Roman Empire is taken over. And interestingly, the Romans did not impose Latin. They learned Greek. They celebrated Greek philosophers. They also created their own story to match that of the Greeks. But they allowed this part. So there's this empire, and there's these different groups, and the Jews among them. Among the Jews, at some point between the close of the Old Testament and the rise of the New Testament, which is a 400-year period, the Jews stopped speaking Hebrew and they started speaking Aramaic. And so when you get to the time of Jesus' birth, when the and then when the New Testament emerges and you come into Palestine, it is a Roman province, first underneath an Idumean king who was a vassal of the Roman Empire. The primary language of the region was Aramaic, but there was a heavy Greek influence. And so something that, and in many ways you don't even see it in the New Testament. The region of Galilee, for example, we know of Nazareth, and Jesus was born there. We know of Capernaum. We know of the Sea of Galilee. That was called the Decapolis in the Greco-Roman Empire. And there were 10 Greek cities. And there was a Greek city that was about 2 miles away from Jesus' hometown that most people think Joseph, his father, his earthly father, probably helped to construct because he was a carpenter. And in those Greek towns, it was that Hellenization culture. And there were a couple of arenas that were for gladiatorial games that were in the Decapolis. And they would have the marketplace, and they would have the baths. And just like in Greek culture, the men would go into the gymnasiums and they would be naked. And that influence was something that the devout Jews were really opposed to. But at the very same time, Jews got spread out across the world through the diaspora, which goes back to the destruction of the temple in 586, I think that was, 586 BC. And so then you have the Jews that are in Palestine, but you have Jews in North Africa, and this is, Carrie was talking about Philo. Philo was a significant Jewish voice philosopher, and he was trying to make Judaism a little bit more understandable to the Greco-Roman mind. He wrote in Greek. So it's a little bit like coming to America, and we have this thing. You can have your culture, but if you really want to get along here, you're going to have to learn the language. That was how the Greco-Roman world worked with Koine Greek. Dominant language in Palestine was Aramaic. Jews would be educated somewhat in the Hebrew Bible, all of them, more devout, more scholarly, more intensive Jews would learn Hebrew, but not everybody really spoke Hebrew or knew it well. And then Greek would be the next most significant language, and then after that, probably Latin, because of the influence of the Roman Empire. And we do have stories, and Paul would be an example of this. If we want to do right at the turn of the century, 4 BC, Herod the Great dies. He was a significant presence in Palestine. He built 7 palaces during his time of being the king of the Jews and the representative for the Romans. When he died, he had 3 different sons who were competing for his kingdom, and one of them goes to Rome to make his case in person to the emperor. Most likely, they knew Latin as well as Greek. So I'm probably giving you more than you asked for, but
I just wondered what they wrote. The actual authors actually.
Well,
because there's 4 choices.
Yeah. Okay, so in that, what they actually wrote, there is a theory that with Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, that maybe that this was first written in Aramaic before it was written in Greek. But we have no witness, no evidence to that. The reason that there's sometimes that speculation is because Matthew has a lot of what's called Aramaisms, where it's like this is how you'd say it if you were Aramaic, but it's not necessarily the case. There's a few instances in our Greek New Testaments. Abba, when we hear Jesus say Abba, they're transliterating the Aramaic. What Jesus invariably spoke when he traveled around Palestine and did his ministry was Aramaic. But when the apostles decided to write down the life of Jesus into biographies, they wrote it into Greek because it was the common language that everybody would understand. And so yeah, that becomes an important point. What we believe as Christians is that the scriptures are inspired by God. And 100% of God, 100% of humans. And so when we're reading these apostolic words, we're reading words that are from human beings in history, rooted in time, and coming from God. But when we're coming to the Greek New Testament, we're not reading a translation. When we read the Greek, we're reading what those authors originally wrote. If you know anything about translation, I know a little bit of Spanish. I took 4 years of Spanish, and you say things a little bit differently in Spanish than you do in English sometimes. And so you never say, I am hungry. estoy hombre. You know, any Spanish person would look at you and just go, you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know, and so every language is a little bit different. In Spanish, you say, I have hunger. So if you want to come to somebody and you want to understand them, the best way to do it is to understand them in their language. You could translate what I say into another language and you can understand it, but it's not as good as the original. When we're reading the New Testament, we're reading what they wrote, not a translation of what they wrote. If Matthew had some Aramaic version of his gospel that we have completely lost and have no witness and never heard about, when we're reading the Gospel of Matthew, we also believe that this was written in Greek for a Greek audience by this eyewitness. So, yeah, that maybe that answers that question. It's that Koine Greek. All 27 books of the New Testament are written in that Koine Greek. It's kind of over and against where in the Old Testament, almost all of it's Hebrew, but the book of Daniel is half of it's written in Hebrew and half of it's written in Aramaic. But yeah. Now, hopefully, I mean, to me, there is really value in all of this of, okay, how did this get put together? We'll hear people make these claims. There is a science behind it. You have a great reason for confidence. And this becomes the other part of, and I forget your name, it was? John. Some of the attacks against our English Bibles is, well, you're just reading a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. And the answer is no. We're starting with and all of your modern major translations, the ESV, the NRSV, the NASB, the NIV, there's a committee of people, and they are going straight to the original text in the original language that it was written in, and then they are translating it from that text into our language. And so it's not a translation upon a translation upon a translation. It is a reconstructed Greek text that's based upon all of the witnesses that we have, and that's why they've updated this, and that's why, you know, the newest version is based upon, you know, when they published it at the time, the 5,600 manuscripts over the 4,300 manuscripts when this was done. And there's been a bunch of scholars who've done their work, and then they come to this text, and then the other part of that becomes we translate based upon how the words were being used back then. And we have a whole bunch of tools and apparatus so that we can sit there and we can say, okay, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And, you know, and this is the part where hopefully, you know, like in good preaching, you will hear some of the fruit of the scholarly work. The word there in the beginning was the Word. That word is logos. And it's not the only word that you have in Greek that could be translated word. And this word is really significant. And it has a history for hundreds of years before it's used at the time of John writing this, where the Greek philosophy is using it. And our biblical scholars are historians. And they sift through all of the philosophy and the history and the language and on all of the significant words. I have this one book on my shelf. It's a Greek dictionary, and it's called a lexicon. And it was $180 when I bought it back in 1995. But it has every word in Greek that's in your Greek New Testament. but when you turn to it, it will show you when that word first appears in Greek literature.
Wow.
And then it will show you and it'll have a little asterisk next to it. And if the asterisk there, it means that underneath this, where it's citing, here's where you can go and find this word. If the asterisk is there, this is every instance that we know of in all extant Greek literature that we have where this word occurs, so that you can go and you can look at this word and then see how it was used by Homer, and then how it was used by Aristotle, and then how it was used in the first century. And that's just one tool that we have. And then we have these Greek dictionaries where it shows the scholarly work that on every major word that you have in your New Testament, there has been numerous scholarly articles done on those words, doing word studies to say, based upon everything that we have from the past, here's how the word was being used in Paul's day. And then sometimes it'll be something where it was like, here was the Greek word, but in the Septuagint, it was translating this Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word has this meaning. And so there's this Old Testament background to it, and here's the original meaning of the Hebrew word, and then here's how the Greek word. And just so you know, I use this stuff every week. When I'm preparing the sermons, I'm doing that. I don't like to, but I mean, because it's important, and it's to understand these things. So that's a little bit of the picture of, yes, they're translating it from Greek. It was written in Greek, but we have a really good sense of what's going on. And there's a little bit with this where I want to put, you have every reason to say the main ideas that you're supposed to get, you can get through your English translations. For me, I do find it helpful. If you watch a black and white movie, you'll know the story, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what's going on. You might miss a little bit of texture. It might not be quite as impressive sometimes. There might be something that you miss because it's not in full color. And for me, that's been one of the most helpful analogies of when you're reading a translation, it's kind of like watching something in black and white. You're getting the most of it. But there is some value in learning the language, but that's not for everybody. And even if you just know the language, it doesn't stop there. You really got to do some more digging, because there's 2,000 years of history, and we're talking about reading a dead language, and that just takes a little bit more work. Have I gone over? I probably have.
It was a great world history lesson.
Yeah.
I felt like that was a whole semester's worth of.
Well,
Exactly, I like it.
Yeah, it was very, very good.
Yeah.
loving Father, thank you for today, and lift up this day, and as we were able to spend a little bit of time talking about the treasure that we have and the way that this treasure has been secured for us. And I thank you for the opportunity that we can understand that we have reason for confidence. And I believe, Lord, that it is directly because you have secured this word for us. And so bless us as we go out. In Jesus' name, amen.